Tom Rodriguez never thought he'd become the guy who obsessed over grass. But here he was, at 6 in the morning, standing in his bathrobe with a cup of coffee, admiring the perfect green carpet that was his front lawn. After 15 years of apartment living, owning a house with a yard felt like winning the lottery. Every blade of grass represented freedom, pride, and countless hours of careful attention. The secret to his success wasn't just dedication. It was his premium garden hose. Not the cheap stuff from the discount store, but a heavy-duty, kink-resistant beauty that delivered water like a gentle rain. Tom had researched hoses for weeks before buying this one, reading reviews and comparing specifications like he was purchasing a car. His neighbors probably thought he was crazy, but they couldn't argue with results. His lawn was the envy of Maple Ridge Gardens, the kind of subdivision where people actually cared about curb appeal. Life was good in Tom's little corner of suburbia. His wife Lisa would joke that he loved the lawn more than her, which wasn't true, but he did spend an awful lot of time making sure every corner got the right amount of water. The morning routine was sacred. Coffee first, then a slow walk around the perimeter, checking for any brown spots or signs of trouble. The hose would come out next, and Tom would spend 45 minutes giving his grass the drink it deserved. The peace didn't last long. The trouble started when the Peterson family moved into the house next door. At first, Tom was excited about new neighbors. The previous owners had let their yard go completely wild, which made Tom's perfect lawn look even better by comparison. But it also meant dealing with weeds trying to creep over the property line. Maybe the new folks would care about their yard too. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Tom watched from his kitchen window as the family directed the movers. There was Mr. Peterson, a thin man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mrs. Peterson seemed to be running the show, clipboard in hand, pointing and gesturing like a conductor leading an orchestra. Their teenage son looked like every other kid his age, more interested in his phone than the chaos around him. Tom introduced himself that evening, bringing over a plate of cookies Lisa had made. The gesture seemed to surprise Mrs. Peterson, whose name turned out to be Carol. She accepted the cookies with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and immediately started asking questions about the neighborhood. How often did they mow their lawns? Were there any rules about parking? What about noise ordinances? Within a week, Carol Peterson had somehow become the new president of the Maple Ridge Gardens Homeowners Association. Tom hadn't even known they had an HOA until Carol mentioned it during their second conversation. Apparently, the previous president had moved away months ago, and the position had been sitting empty. Carol saw an opportunity and grabbed it. At first, Tom thought having an organized neighbor might be nice. Carol seemed to care about keeping the neighborhood looking good, which aligned with his own values. She organized a community cleanup day and sent around a newsletter with helpful reminders about trash pickup schedules. Tom even volunteered to help with some of the flower beds near the entrance to their subdivision. The problem started small. Tom noticed his hose had been moved one morning. Not a big deal. Maybe Lisa had used it for something. But then it happened again, and this time the hose was connected to a sprinkler that had been set up in the common area near the mailboxes. Tom walked over to investigate and found Carol watering the community flower beds. "Oh, hi, Tom," she said, not looking embarrassed at all. "I hope you don't mind. I needed to get these plants watered before it got too hot." Tom minded, but he didn't want to seem petty. These were community flowers, after all, and Carol was volunteering her time. He smiled and said it was fine, but asked if she could put the hose back when she was done. Carol nodded, but Tom noticed she didn't actually promise anything. It happened again the next week, and the week after that. Each time, Tom would find his hose stretched across both yards, connected to some project Carol had decided needed attention. She was always friendly about it, always had a reasonable explanation, but she never asked permission. She just helped. Herself, like Tom's hose was community property. The situation got worse when Carol's son started using the hose too. Tom came home from work one afternoon to find the kid washing his bike in their driveway. The hose snaked all the way from Tom's house. When Tom approached, the boy just shrugged and said his mom told him it was okay. Tom felt his jaw clench, but he kept his voice calm. Hey, next time just ask first, okay? The kid nodded, but Tom could tell he didn't really understand why it mattered. To him it was just a hose. But to Tom, it represented something bigger. It was his property, his investment in keeping his lawn perfect. Every minute that hose spent watering someone else's project was a minute his own grass went thirsty. Lisa noticed Tom's growing frustration. Just talk to Carol, she suggested. I'm sure she doesn't realize it's bothering you. But Tom had tried dropping hints. He'd mentioned how much his water bill had gone up. He'd made jokes about running a lawn service. Carol either didn't get it or didn't care. She'd nod and smile, then show up with the hose again the next week. The final straw came on a Saturday morning in late July. Tom woke up early, excited about giving his lawn a good soaking before the day got too hot. The weather had been brutal, and his grass was starting to show stress despite his careful attention. He needed to get water on it soon, or he'd start seeing brown patches. He walked outside in his robe, coffee in hand, ready for his morning ritual. But his hose wasn't there. Tom looked around, confused. Maybe Lisa had moved it for some reason. Then he heard the sound of rushing water and followed it to its source. Carol Peterson was standing in her driveway, using Tom's hose to fill up a kiddie pool. Not a small one either, but one of those big inflatable pools that could hold half the neighborhood kids. She had the hose cranked up to full pressure, and water was gushing in like she was filling a swimming pool. Tom stood there for a moment, watching his premium hose being used to create a backyard water park while his own grass wilted in the morning sun. His water bill flashed through his mind. All those extra gallons, month after month, going to projects he'd never agreed to support. Carol, Tom called out, trying to keep his voice level. I need my hose back. She looked up, surprised to see him. Oh, hi, Tom. I'm just getting this ready for the kids. It's going to be such a hot day. I understand, but I need to water my lawn. It's my morning routine. Carol glanced at his lawn, then back at the pool. This will just take a few more minutes. Your grass looks fine. Tom felt something snap inside him. His grass looked fine because he took care of it. Because he watered it every morning with his own hose, using his own water on his own schedule. He'd been patient, he'd been neighborly. But apparently that had been interpreted as permission to treat his property like a public utility. Actually, I need it now, Tom said. His voice a little sharper than he'd intended. Carol's expression changed. And for the first time, Tom saw something calculating in her eyes. This wasn't about convenience or community spirit. This was about control, about seeing how far she could push before he pushed back. The battle lines had been drawn. And Tom realized he was about to learn exactly what kind of neighbor Carol Peterson really was. The tension in Tom's driveway was thick enough to cut with a knife. Carol Peterson stood there with his hose in her hands, water still gushing into her oversized kiddie pool, while Tom waited for her to acknowledge that she'd crossed a line. But instead of apologizing or even looking embarrassed, Carol did something that caught Tom completely off guard. She smiled, not a friendly smile, not an apologetic smile. It was the kind of smile politicians use when they're about to explain why your tax increase is actually good for you. Tom, I think we need to have a conversation about community responsibility, Carol said, finally turning off the water but keeping hold of his hose. As the HOA president, I've been thinking about how we can all work together to make our neighborhood the best it can be. Tom blinked. This is about my hose, Carol. I just want to water my lawn. Of course, and your lawn looks wonderful. But think about the bigger picture here. We have community areas that need maintenance. Flower beds that represent all of us when people drive through our neighborhood. Don't you think it's a little selfish to hoard resources when we could be working together? The word selfish hit Tom like a slap. He'd been nothing but accommodating for weeks, letting Carol use his property without complaint, and now he was being called selfish for wanting to use his own hose. It's not hoarding, Tom said, his voice tighter than he intended. It's my hose. I bought it, I pay for the water. I use it to maintain my property. Carol nodded like she was listening, but Tom could see she was already preparing her counterargument. I understand you feel that way, but let's look at this from a community perspective. The HOA has certain responsibilities, and sometimes that means individual homeowners need to contribute to the greater good. Contributing is one thing. Having my stuff taken without asking is another. Taken? Carol's eyebrows shot up like Tom had accused her of stealing the crown jewels. Tom, I'm not taking anything. I'm borrowing a hose to maintain community property. Property that benefits everyone, including you. The conversation was spinning out of control, and Tom realized Carol had somehow managed to make him feel like the unreasonable one. This was clearly a skill she'd developed over years of getting her way through sheer force of personality. Look, Tom said, trying to reset the conversation. I'm not against helping the community, but you need to ask first. And you can't just assume my hose is available whenever you want it. Carol's smile faltered for just a moment, and Tom caught a glimpse of something harder underneath. Then the smile was back, brighter than before. Of course, you're absolutely right. Communication is so important. Tell you what, let me finish filling this pool for the kids, and then we can sit down and work out a schedule that works for everyone. Tom wanted to say no. He wanted to take his hose back right then and there. But Carol had already turned the water back on, and now there were kids' voices coming from inside her house. She'd positioned the conversation so that saying no would mean disappointing children on a hot summer day. 15 minutes, Tom said. Then I need it back. Absolutely, Carol replied, but she was already focused on the pool again, like the conversation was over. Tom walked back to his house, frustrated and confused about how he'd ended up agreeing to wait even longer to water his own lawn. Lisa was in the kitchen, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong. What happened? She asked. Tom explained the conversation, and with each detail, he could see Lisa's expression getting more concerned. She called you selfish for wanting to use your own hose? She made it sound reasonable when she said it, like I was being petty for not thinking about the community. Lisa peeked out the window at Carol, who was now directing her son to test the pool's depth. Tom, that woman is manipulating you. She's taking advantage of the fact that you're a nice person who doesn't want to cause trouble. Tom knew Lisa was right, but knowing it and doing something about it were two different things. He wasn't the type to cause neighborhood drama. He just wanted to water his grass and live in peace. 15 minutes turned into 30, then 45. Tom watched from his window as Carol's pool project expanded. She brought out pool toys, set up lawn chairs, even started preparing snacks. What had been presented as a quick favor was turning into an all-day event. Finally, Tom couldn't wait any longer. His grass was already starting to look stressed, and the day was getting hotter. He walked back over to Carol's yard, where she was now supervising 3 neighborhood kids who were splashing around in the pool. Carol, I really need my hose now. She looked up from her lawn chair, shading her eyes with her hand. Oh, Tom, the kids are having such a great time. Could you give us maybe another hour? My grass is dying. I'm sure it's fine. It's been this hot before. Tom felt his patience evaporate. Carol, give me my hose back. Now. The sharpness in his voice caused the kids to stop splashing and stare. Carol's expression shifted, and suddenly she wasn't the friendly neighborhood HOA president anymore. She was someone who'd been challenged and didn't like it. Tom, I think you're overreacting. It's just grass. It's my grass. On my property. That I maintain with my hose and my water. Carol stood up slowly, and Tom realized she was taller than he'd thought. You know what? You're right. It is your property. Just like this neighborhood is my responsibility as HOA president. Tom didn't like where this was going. What does that mean? Carol walked over to where she'd left her ever-present clipboard, flipped through a few pages, and pulled out a sheet of paper. It means that as a homeowner in Maple Ridge Gardens, you agreed to abide by certain community standards when you bought your house. What are you talking about? HOA regulations, Tom. Rules about lawn maintenance, property appearance, community cooperation. Rules that give me the authority to ensure everyone is contributing to our neighborhood's success. Tom stared at the paper Carol was holding, trying to read the small print from where he stood. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining your obligations. For instance, did you know that lawns need to be maintained to community standards? And that failure to cooperate with HOA maintenance requests can result in fines? The conversation had taken a surreal turn. Tom was being threatened with fines for not letting his neighbor use his hose whenever she wanted. Carol, this is crazy. You can't fine me for wanting to use my own property. I can fine you for violating HOA regulations. And I can fine you for failure to maintain community standards. Your choice. Tom looked around at the kids in the pool, at the neighbors who had started to gather and watch the confrontation, at Carol standing there with her clipboard like some kind of suburban dictator. This wasn't about hoses or grass anymore. This was about power, and Carol had just made it clear who she thought had it. Keep the hose, Tom said quietly, for today. Carol's smile returned, but it wasn't friendly, it was victorious. I'm so glad we could work this out, Tom. Community cooperation is so important. Tom walked back to his house, his hands shaking, with anger and frustration. Through the kitchen window, Lisa had watched the entire confrontation. What just happened? She asked when he came inside. I think I just got played by a neighborhood dictator, Tom replied, slumping into a chair at the kitchen table. As he sat there, watching Carol direct her pool party through the window, Tom realized that being a good neighbor had somehow made him a target. Carol had tested his boundaries, found them weak, and now she was taking advantage. The reasonable approach hadn't worked. Being patient hadn't worked. Being accommodating had only made things worse. That evening, as Tom surveyed his slightly brown lawn and calculated what his next water bill would look like, he came to a conclusion that surprised him. Sometimes when reasonable people are dealing with unreasonable situations, the solution isn't to be more reasonable. Sometimes the solution is to get creative. Tom spent the next 3 days stewing over what had happened. Every time he looked out his window and saw his hose stretched across Carol's yard like she owned it, his blood pressure went up another notch. Lisa had suggested he call the police. But what was he going to say? Officer, my neighbor is using my garden hose without permission? They'd probably hang up on him. The worst part was that Carol had been right about one thing. Tom had signed HOA documents when he bought the house. But like most people, he'd never actually read them. Now he was wondering what exactly he'd agreed to. He dug through his filing cabinet until he found the thick folder from his real estate closing and started reading through pages of legal jargon. Most of it was standard stuff about keeping your property maintained and not painting your house. Bright orange. But buried in Section 12, subsection 4, was a paragraph that made Tom's stomach drop. It talked about community resource sharing and cooperation with HOA maintenance activities. The language was vague enough that someone like Carol could probably twist it to mean whatever she wanted it to mean. Tom realized he needed help. Real help, not just sympathy from Lisa. He called his brother Danny, who worked in construction, and knew more about plumbing than anyone Tom had ever met. Danny had also dealt with his share of difficult people over the years. So, let me get this straight, Danny said after Tom explained the situation. This woman is basically stealing your water, threatening to fine you if you complain, and hiding behind some HOA nonsense to justify it. That's about the size of it. And you want to know what your options are? I want to know how to make it stop without ending up in a legal battle or having to move. Danny was quiet for a moment. Tom could hear him thinking through the problem. The way he approached a tricky plumbing job, looking for angles and solutions that weren't immediately obvious. You know what your real problem is? Danny finally said. You're playing by rules that don't exist. She's not being reasonable, so trying to reason with her is like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. So what do? You need to make her not want to use your hose anymore. Right now, it's all benefit and no downside for her. She gets free water, free equipment, and she gets to feel powerful by pushing you around. You need to change that equation. Tom had never thought about it that way, but Danny was right. Carol kept using his hose because it was convenient and consequence-free. She'd learned that Tom would complain but ultimately back down. Why would she change when the current arrangement works so well for her? What did you have in mind? Well, you could disconnect the hose when you're not using it. Make her work. For it? Tom had tried that. Carol had knocked on his door at 7 in the morning asking him to reconnect it for her community project. When he'd refused, she'd made a note on her clipboard about failure to cooperate with HOA maintenance requests. That didn't work, she just uses it as ammunition against me. Okay, what if you got a locking hose reel? Something she can't just grab when she wants it? Tom had considered that too, but he'd realized it would just escalate things. Carol would probably cite some HOA rule about obstructing community access or something equally ridiculous. Vanny, I need something more creative. Something that makes her want to stop using it without giving her a reason to come after me. There was another long pause. Tom could almost hear the gears turning in his brother's head. Tom, you know what? The difference is between clean water and dirty water. What do you mean? I mean, your hose is connected to your house's water supply, right? Clean, drinkable water. But that's not the only water line coming out of your house. Tom felt a little spark of understanding. Go on. Well, you've got your main water line, but you've also got your washing machine drain, your sink drainage, shower runoff. That's all gray water. Not sewage, nothing dangerous, but definitely not something you'd want to drink or put on plants you care about. The spark was growing into a flame. And theoretically, if someone were to redirect a hose connection, theoretically, it would be a simple matter of installing a valve system. A few pipes, a couple of connections, maybe an afternoon's work for someone who knew what they were doing. Tom was starting to smile for the first time in days. And if someone were to accidentally connect to the wrong water source, well, they'd get exactly what they deserved, wouldn't they? The beauty of the plan was in its simplicity. Carol wasn't stealing Tom's hose, she was just borrowing it. And if she borrowed it when it happened to be connected to the gray water system instead of the clean water supply, well, that was just an unfortunate coincidence. Tom spent the next day researching the technical details. It turned out Danny was right about the installation being relatively simple. Tom's house was set up in a way that made it easy to access both the main water line and the gray water drainage. All he needed was a three-way valve system that would let him choose which water source the hose was connected to. The hardware store clerk was helpful without being too curious about Tom's project. Doing some irrigation work? He asked as he rang up the pipes and fittings. Something like that, Tom replied. The installation took most of Saturday morning. Tom waited until Carol and her family had left for some kind of community event, then got to work in his basement. The main water line was exactly where he'd expected it to be, and the gray water drainage was easy to access thanks to his house's layout. The trickiest part was installing the valve system in a way that looked professional. Tom didn't want anyone to stumble across his modification and start asking questions. He ran the new pipes along the existing plumbing, secured everything properly, and tested the connections to make sure there were no leaks. By lunchtime, Tom had a choice. He could turn a simple valve and switch his hose connection from clean city water to the gray water from his washing machine and bathroom sinks. The gray water wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't exactly pleasant either. It would smell like soap and laundry detergent, and it would probably have a few things floating in it that no one would want to spray on their flowers. Lisa came down to the basement to see what Tom had been working on. He explained the system, and she listened with a growing smile. So when Carol uses your hose now, she get exactly what she's been asking for. Water from our house. Tom Rodriguez, you devious man, I'm impressed. It's not permanent, Tom said, testing the valve one more time. I can switch it back anytime. But next time she helps herself to my hose without asking, she's going to get a surprise. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Tom had just finished cleaning up his tools when he heard Carol's car pull into her driveway. Through the basement window, he could see her, unloading supplies from her trunk. It looked like she was planning another community project. Tom went upstairs and casually looked out his kitchen window. Sure enough, Carol was eyeing his hose. She'd probably wait until Monday morning when Tom left for work, then help herself to it for whatever she had planned. Tom smiled and went to make himself a sandwich. The trap was set. All he had to do now was wait for Carol to spring it. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of perfect summer weather that made Tom's grass practically beg for water. He went through his usual routine, coffee first, then a walk around his lawn to check on things. His grass was looking better since he'd managed to get some consistent watering over the weekend. But he could still see the stress from all those interrupted sessions. Thanks to Carol's borrowing habits, Tom had set his alarm 15 minutes earlier than usual. He wanted to be ready for whatever Carol had planned. As he sipped his coffee by the kitchen window, he watched her house for any signs of activity. At exactly 7:30, Carol's garage door opened, and she emerged with what looked like a brand-new sprinkler system still in its packaging. Tom's pulse quickened. This was it. Carol was planning another community beautification project, and she'd need water to test her new equipment. He watched her walk around to the side of her house where the community flower beds were located, then disappear from view. 5 minutes later, Tom heard the familiar sound of his hose being dragged across the driveway. Carol was right on schedule. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before, completely comfortable with helping herself to his property. Tom could see her through his side window, connecting his hose to her new sprinkler system. The moment of truth had arrived. Tom went down to his basement and found the valve he'd installed over the weekend. His hand paused for just a second before he turned it. Once he flipped this switch, there was no going back. Carol was about to get a lesson in boundaries that she'd never forget. Tom turned the valve upstairs. He positioned himself at the kitchen window where he had a perfect view of the community flower beds. Carol was adjusting her new sprinkler, probably trying to get the spray pattern just right. She had no idea that the water flowing through Tom's hose was no longer coming from the city's clean water supply. At first, nothing seemed different. Water was water, at least for the first few seconds. Carol stood back to admire her handiwork as the sprinkler began its rotation, sending an arc of water across the flower beds. She even pulled out her phone to take a picture, probably for the newsletter. Then the smell hit. Tom watched Carol's expression change from satisfaction to confusion. She tilted her head like she was trying to figure out what was different. The smell of laundry detergent and soap was subtle at first, but it got stronger as more gray water flowed through the system. Carol stepped closer to the sprinkler, and Tom could see her nose wrinkle. She was definitely smelling something now, but she hadn't figured out what it was yet. Maybe she thought it was just fertilizer or something in the soil. That's when she noticed the water itself looked different. Gray water isn't crystal clear, like tap water. It has a slightly cloudy appearance, and sometimes it carries small particles of lint or soap residue. Carol bent down to get a closer look at the water pooling around the base of the sprinkler. Tom couldn't hear what she said, but he could read her lips well enough to know it wasn't polite. Carol quickly turned off the sprinkler and disconnected it from the hose. She held the end of the hose up to examine the water coming out, and Tom watched her face go from confusion to disgust to absolute horror as she realized what she was looking at. The water coming out of Tom's hose was gray, sudsy, and smelled like a laundromat. Tiny flecks of lint and soap scum floated in the stream. Carol dropped the hose like it was a snake and jumped back, shaking her hands like she'd touched something contaminated. Tom had to bite his lip to keep from laughing out loud. Carol was looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. She picked up the hose again, this time holding it at arm's length, and examined the water more closely. The smell was getting stronger as Tom's washing machine upstairs finished its rinse cycle, sending a fresh surge of detergent-scented water through the system. That's when Carol noticed the damage to her precious community flower beds, the prize-winning roses that she'd been so proud of were now dripping with gray, soapy water. The mulch around the plants was soaked with sudsy runoff that smelled like fabric softener and bathroom soap. Carol started running around the flower beds, trying to figure out how much damage had been done. She grabbed a watering can from her garage and started frantically trying to rinse the soap off the plants with clean water. But the damage was already done. The roses looked like they'd been through a car wash. Tom watched the whole scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. His plan had worked better than he dared to hope. Carol had gotten exactly what she deserved, and she'd done it to herself by helping herself to his property without permission. But the best part was still coming. Other neighbors had started to notice the commotion. Mrs. Williams from across the street came over to see what was happening. Then Mr. Johnson from 2 houses down joined the growing crowd. Carol was trying to explain what had happened. But how do you explain that you've been using your neighbor's hose without permission and somehow ended up spraying dirty water all over the community flower beds? Tom could see Carol pointing at his house, then at the hose, then at the ruined flower beds. The neighbors were listening, but their expressions suggested they weren't entirely sympathetic. After all, what had Carol been doing with Tom's hose in the first place? The situation got even better when Carol's son came outside to see what all the fuss was about. He took one look at the soapy mess and started laughing. "Mom, what did you do? It smells like the laundry room out here." Carol's face was getting redder by the minute. She was clearly embarrassed, but she was also angry. Tom could see her looking toward his house with the kind of expression that suggested she suspected he might have something to do with this, but that was the beauty of Tom's plan. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd installed a perfectly legal plumbing modification on his own property. If Carol had asked to use his hose, he could have warned her about the system. But since she'd helped herself without permission, she'd gotten whatever happened to be coming through the pipes at the time. Tom decided it was time to make an appearance. He walked outside, coffee cup in hand, wearing his best concerned neighbor expression. "Carol, is everything okay over there? I heard some commotion." Carol turned to face him, and Tom could see she was struggling to control her temper. "Tom, there's something wrong with your hose. It's spraying dirty water all over our community flower beds." Tom walked over to investigate, making sure to look appropriately surprised and concerned. "Really? That's strange. Let me take a look." He picked up the hose and examined the water coming out of it. "Oh, wow, that doesn't look right at all. I wonder what could cause that. I don't know, but it's ruined our roses. They're covered in soap and ... and whatever that stuff is floating in the water." Tom nodded sympathetically. "That's terrible. You know, I've been having some plumbing issues lately. My brother helped me install a new drainage system over the weekend. I hope that's not related to this problem." The lie came easily, and it was technically true. Tom had been having drainage issues in the sense that he'd wanted to create a new drainage option for situations exactly like this one. "Can you fix it?" Carol asked, and Tom could hear the desperation in her voice. "I'll call my brother and see what he thinks. But Carol, next time you need to use my hose, maybe just ask first. That way I can make sure everything's working properly before you start any projects." The message was clear, and everyone standing around understood it. Carol had been caught using Tom's property without permission, and now she was dealing with the consequences. Tom could see the exact moment when Carol realized she'd been outplayed. Her anger shifted to something that looked almost like respect. She'd pushed him too far, and he'd pushed back in a way she never saw coming. "I'll help you clean this up," Tom offered, because he was still a good neighbor, even when he was teaching someone a lesson. "That would be appreciated," Carol replied, and for the first time since she'd moved in, she sounded genuinely humble. As they worked together to rinse the soap off the damaged plants, Tom couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to let the other person solve it for you. The cleanup took almost 2 hours. Tom and Carol worked side by side, hosing down the soapy flower beds with clean water from Carol's kitchen sink. It was slow going because they had to carry water in buckets and watering cans, but the roses were finally starting to look normal again. The whole time, neither of them mentioned the obvious question hanging in the air. How exactly had Tom's hose ended up connected to gray water? Word about the incident spread through Maple Ridge Gardens faster than a brush fire. By Tuesday morning, Tom could tell that everyone knew what had happened. He got knowing looks from Mr. Johnson when he picked up his mail. Mrs. Williams waved at him with what looked like approval. Even the teenagers who lived down the street seemed to be grinning when they saw him. But the real test came on Wednesday, when the monthly HOA meeting was scheduled. Tom had never bothered attending before, but this time he decided to show up. He wanted to see how Carol handled herself after what had happened. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building that usually hosted birthday parties and baby showers. About 20 neighbors showed up, which was apparently a record turnout. Tom could feel the tension in the room as soon as he walked in. Everyone was trying to act normal, but there was an undercurrent of excitement. Like people were waiting for a show to start. Carol called the meeting to order with her usual clipboard and official tone, but Tom noticed she seemed less confident than before. She rushed through the regular business, talking about trash pickup schedules and reminding everyone about the annual block party. But then she got to the part everyone was waiting for. I want to address the incident that occurred on Monday morning, Carol said, not looking directly at anyone. As you all probably know, there was a problem with the community flower bed maintenance that resulted in some damage to our prize-winning roses. Mrs. Williams raised her hand. Carol, wasn't that caused by using someone else's hose without permission? The room went dead quiet. Carol's face turned red, and Tom could see her struggling to maintain her composure. This was not going according to whatever script she'd prepared. Well, yes, there was a miscommunication about resource sharing, Carol admitted. But the real issue is that we need to establish clearer guidelines about community maintenance responsibilities. Tom couldn't believe it. Even after getting caught and embarrassed, Carol was still trying to spin the situation to make it sound like the problem was unclear rules rather than her entitled behavior. Mr. Johnson spoke up from the back of the room. Carol, what miscommunication? You took the man's hose without asking. That's not a miscommunication. That's just rude. Other neighbors started nodding and murmuring agreement. Tom realized that his little gray water lesson had done more than just embarrass Carol. It had given everyone else permission to speak up about behavior they'd probably been tolerating for months. I think we need to talk about boundaries, said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived near the entrance to the subdivision. Some of us have been feeling like our personal property has been treated as community property, and that's not right. Carol looked around the room and seemed to realize that the tide had turned against her. The authority she'd been wielding so confidently was suddenly gone. People weren't afraid of her clipboard and her threats anymore. I understand there have been some concerns, Carol said, her voice smaller than usual. Maybe we should form a committee to review our community guidelines. Or maybe, said Tom, speaking up for the first time, we could just agree that people should ask before using other people's property. The room erupted in agreement. Exactly. That's all we're asking for. Just basic courtesy. Carol looked like she wanted to disappear. Tom almost felt sorry for her, but then he remembered all the mornings he'd had to wait to water his lawn. All the extra money on his water bill. All the times she'd made him feel unreasonable for wanting to use his own hose. The meeting ended with a unanimous agreement that all future community maintenance would be done with properly purchased community equipment stored in the community center shed. No more borrowing from individual homeowners without explicit permission. Carol agreed to the new policy through gritted teeth. As people filed out of the meeting, several neighbors came over to thank Tom. About time someone stood up to her, Mr. Johnson said with a grin. That was brilliant, whatever you did. Tom just smiled and said he was glad everything worked out, but the real resolution came the following Saturday morning. Tom was outside watering his lawn, enjoying the peaceful routine he'd missed so much, when Carol approached from her yard. Tom tensed up, wondering if she was going to start another confrontation. Instead, Carol stopped at the property line and waited until Tom noticed her. When he turned off his hose, she spoke in a voice that was completely different from her usual commanding tone. Tom, I owe you an apology. Tom blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. What? I said I owe you an apology. I was wrong to use your hose without asking. I was wrong to threaten you with HOA violations when you objected. and I was wrong to treat your property like it belonged to the community. Tom set down his hose and walked over to the fence. Carol looked genuinely contrite, not like she was putting on an act or trying to manipulate him. I got carried away with the HOA president role, Carol continued. I thought I was helping the neighborhood, but really I was just being a bully. What happened on Monday was embarrassing, but it was also a wake-up call. I needed to learn that lesson. Carol, I appreciate you saying that. I also wanted to ask you about buying my own hose. A good one, like yours. Do you have any recommendations? Tom couldn't help but smile. Actually, I do. There's a hardware store about 10 minutes from here that has exactly what you need. They talked for a few more minutes about hose specifications and watering schedules. It was a normal, neighborly conversation, the kind Tom had hoped to have when Carol first moved in. No clipboard, no threats, no HOA regulations. Just two people figuring out how to coexist peacefully. That afternoon, Tom went down to his basement and turned the valve back to the clean water supply. The gray water system had served its purpose, but he didn't need it anymore. Carol had learned her lesson, and the neighborhood had established new boundaries that everyone could live with. A few weeks later, Tom watched from his kitchen window as Carol watered the community flower beds with her own brand-new hose connected to her own water supply. The roses had recovered from their soap bath and were blooming better than ever. Carol had even planted some new varieties that complemented Tom's lawn beautifully. Lisa joined him at the window, coffee cup in hand. Look at that, she's actually doing a nice job with those flowers. She is, Tom agreed. Turns out she's not a bad neighbor when she's not trying to take over the world. Think you'll ever tell her about your plumbing modification? Tom considered it for a moment, then shook his head. Some secrets are better kept. Besides, it's disconnected now. Just a reminder in my basement that sometimes you have to get creative to solve problems. The neighborhood settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. Tom went back to his morning lawn routine without interruption. Carol threw herself into legitimate community projects using proper resources. The annual block party was a success, with everyone contributing something and no one being forced to share more than they wanted to. Sometimes, Tom would catch Carol looking at his hose with a thoughtful expression, like she was trying to figure out exactly what had happened that Monday morning. But she never asked, and Tom never told. Some lessons are better learned through experience than explanation. And every time Tom turned on his hose to water his perfect lawn, he smiled a little, remembering that sometimes the best way to teach someone about boundaries is to show them exactly what happens when those boundaries get crossed.